Imagine a world where one city, just one small settlement on the banks of a river, grew so powerful that it ruled over millions of people across 3 continents. That city was Rome, and for hundreds of years, the Roman Empire was the heartbeat of the ancient world. But how did this tiny place grow into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? And why did it eventually crumble and fall? Today, we are going to take a journey together to understand the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. By the end of this story, you'll feel like you've traveled back in time, walking the streets of ancient Rome, meeting its leaders, and witnessing both its glory and its downfall. So, let's dive in. But first, let me ask you this. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to live in a city where gladiators fought lions for entertainment, where aqueducts carried fresh water for miles, and where a single emperor's decision could change the fate of the entire world? That's the world of Rome, and it's one of the most fascinating stories in human history. Our story begins way back, long before Rome was an empire, before it even called itself a republic. Around 753 BC, according to legend, the city of Rome was founded by 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus. They were said to be raised by a wolf after being abandoned as babies, and later Romulus killed Remus in a fight over where to build the new city. It sounds like a myth, right? And it probably is. But stories like these tell us how much Romans believed their city was destined for greatness. Even from its mythical beginnings, Rome saw itself as special. But destiny alone wasn't enough. Rome had to grow, and it had to fight. At first, Rome was just a small settlement surrounded by rival tribes in Italy. Life wasn't glamorous. Imagine simple houses, farmers working in fields, and soldiers ready to defend their land. But Rome had something that made it different. It had determination. Romans believed in discipline, loyalty, and never giving up. Over time, this mindset helped them defeat neighboring tribes and slowly expand their territory. By the time we reach around 500 BC, Rome had thrown off its kings and decided to run itself as a republic. This meant that power wasn't in the hands of one ruler, but instead shared by elected officials and a senate. It wasn't democracy like we know today, but for the ancient world, it was pretty advanced. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Roman Republic wasn't just about politics, it was about military power. Every Roman citizen was expected to serve in the army, and the army became Rome's greatest strength. Roman soldiers weren't just fighters. They were trained, disciplined, and organized like no other. They fought in tight formations, built roads to move quickly, and used clever strategies to outsmart their enemies. That's how Rome began to expand beyond its little corner of Italy. By 264 BC, Rome had grown strong enough to clash with another great power of the time, Carthage, a city in North Africa. This rivalry led to the Punic Wars, some of the most famous wars in history. The Second Punic War introduced the world to Hannibal, a Carthaginian general who did something unbelievable. He marched his army, including elephants, across the Alps to attack Rome. Can you picture that? Elephants trudging through snow-covered mountains. It sounds impossible, but Hannibal pulled it off. For years, he defeated Roman armies, and it seemed like Rome might be crushed. But Rome didn't give up. Through determination and strategy, Rome eventually turned the tables and destroyed Carthage. By the end of the Punic Wars, Rome wasn't just a local power anymore. It controlled huge parts of the Mediterranean. This was the beginning of Rome's true rise. As the Republic expanded, it brought in massive wealth, new lands, and countless slaves. Roman generals became celebrities, adored for their victories. But here's the catch. Success also brought problems. With so much wealth coming in, the gap between the rich and poor grew wider. The Roman Senate was often controlled by wealthy elites who cared more about their own power than the common people. This led to political corruption, social unrest, and sometimes even violence in the streets of Rome. One of the first major figures to challenge this was Julius Caesar. You've probably heard his name. He's one of the most famous Romans ever. Caesar was a brilliant general who conquered Gaul, which is basically modern-day France, and he became incredibly popular with the people and his soldiers. But his rise worried the Senate. They feared he was becoming too powerful. When Caesar marched his army into Rome in 49 BC, he essentially declared war on the Republic itself. The result? He won, and he became the dictator of Rome. Now, Caesar did many things to improve Rome. He reformed the calendar, giving us the Julian calendar that eventually evolved into the one we use today. He passed laws to help the poor and expanded Roman citizenship. But he also made enemies. On March 15, 44 BC, the famous Ides of March, Caesar was assassinated by senators who thought they were saving the Republic. Instead, they threw Rome into chaos. Civil wars broke out, and eventually Caesar's adopted son Octavian, later known as Augustus, emerged victorious. And this is the turning point. With Augustus, Rome shifted from being a republic to becoming an empire. Augustus didn't call himself a king, but let's be honest, he was the first emperor of Rome. Under his leadership, Rome entered a golden age known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. For about 200 years, the empire was stable, prosperous, and powerful. Imagine a world connected by Roman roads stretching thousands of miles, aqueducts carrying fresh water into cities, grand arenas like the Colosseum filled with cheering crowds, and trade flowing from Britain to Egypt. That was the height of Rome's power. But let's pause for a second. Imagine walking through the streets of Rome at its peak. You'd see marble temples, bustling markets, soldiers marching in formation, and people from all over the empire, Greeks, Egyptians, Persians, Africans, all living under Roman rule. The empire was like a giant melting pot of cultures, languages, and ideas. Doesn't that sound a lot like our modern world today, where different cultures mix together? Of course, not everything was perfect. Rome had its fair share of the problems even during its golden age. Emperors could be wise and fair, like Marcus Aurelius, or cruel and dangerous, like Nero. The people loved the bread and circuses, free food and gladiator games, to keep them entertained, but deep down, cracks were forming. As Rome expanded, it became harder to control. The army was stretched thin, rebellions popped up in different regions, and sometimes emperors were more interested in their own pleasures than in governing properly. And here's something surprising. While we often think of Rome as this massive, unbeatable empire, it was constantly fighting to hold itself together. For example, in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the city of Pompeii under ash, a reminder that even the greatest empires can't control nature. Later, in the 200s AD, Rome entered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, where emperors came and went so quickly that it almost felt like chaos. Some were assassinated, others were overthrown, and the empire nearly collapsed. But Rome didn't fall just yet. Leaders like Diocletian and Constantine tried to save it. Diocletian divided the empire into eastern and western halves to make it easier to govern, and Constantine made Christianity the official religion, changing the empire forever. Christianity, which had started as a small group of followers who were often persecuted, now became the faith of millions. This was one of Rome's most lasting legacies, spreading Christianity across Europe and beyond. By this point, though, the Western Roman Empire was struggling. Barbarian tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Huns were attacking from outside. Inside, Rome was dealing with corruption, weak leadership, and economic troubles. In 476 AD, the final blow came when the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown. The Western Roman Empire was gone. But the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years, with its capital in Constantinople. And that's the incredible story of the rise and fall of Rome, at least part of it. But before we finish, let's think about this. Rome's story isn't just about battles and emperors, it's about how human ambition can create something extraordinary, but also how greed, corruption, and division can destroy it. Doesn't that sound like a lesson we can still learn from today? So now we've seen how Rome grew from a small village into the greatest empire of the ancient world. We've walked through its legendary founding, its republic, its wars, and its golden age under the emperors. But here's the part that makes this story truly fascinating. Rome didn't last forever, and its decline and fall are just as dramatic as its rise. In fact, the fall of Rome has become one of the most studied and debated events in history, and even today, people wonder, could something like that happen again to our modern empires? Let us explore how such a powerful empire slowly crumbled and what lessons we can learn from it. Picture Rome at its height again. The Colosseum is full of cheering crowds. Roman roads connect cities across Europe, Africa, and Asia, and emperors sit on golden thrones surrounded by marble palaces. It might seem like nothing could bring down a superpower this strong. But remember, cracks had already started forming. Running such a massive empire was like trying to carry a huge weight on your shoulders. It might look impressive at first, but eventually it wears you down. One of the first big issues was political instability. Rome never had a clear system for deciding who would be emperor. Sometimes a ruler would name his successor, sometimes the Senate would decide, and sometimes the army would simply kill the emperor and declare their own general as the new one. Can you imagine living in a country where the leader changes every few years because of assassination or civil war? That's what life was like in Rome. From 235 to 284 AD, the empire went through more than 20 emperors in less than 50 years. Some historians call this time the crisis of the 3rd century, and let me tell you, it was chaos. The empire was constantly divided by civil wars, invasions, and rebellions. At the same time, Rome faced serious economic problems. Wars were expensive, and the empire needed money to pay its soldiers, build roads, and keep the people happy with food and entertainment. To solve this, emperors started raising taxes, but that just made life harder for farmers and merchants. They also began printing more coins but with less silver in them, which led to inflation. Sound familiar? It's like when prices today keep going up because money loses its value. Ordinary Romans struggled to survive while the rich elite often lived in luxury. This gap between rich and poor made the empire weaker and more divided. Another problem was Rome's over-reliance on slaves. Conquered lands provided slaves who worked in fields, built roads, and served in households. But when Rome stopped expanding as much, the supply of new slaves dried up. This hurt the economy and made it harder to maintain the same level of productivity. Think about it. When a system depends on constant growth, what happens when growth slows down? That's exactly what Rome experienced. Meanwhile, on the empire's borders, new threats were rising. Barbarian tribes, as the Romans called them, were pushing closer and closer. These groups included the Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and many others. At first, Rome was strong enough to keep them out, but over time, it became harder to defend such a huge border. Imagine trying to guard a giant fence that stretches thousands of miles, with enemies constantly testing it. Eventually, some tribes began pushing through. One of the most dramatic moments came in 410 AD when the Visigoths, led by Alaric, actually invaded and sacked the city of Rome itself. Can you imagine the shock? For centuries, Romans had believed their city was invincible, the eternal city. But now, barbarians were inside its walls, looting treasures, burning houses, and leaving Romans stunned. It was a huge psychological blow, showing the empire wasn't untouchable anymore. But the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire came in 476 AD. By this time, Rome was weak, divided, and struggling. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was just a teenager when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer forced him to step down. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire was gone. After hundreds of years of dominance, the empire that had once ruled the known world had fallen. Now, here's something really important to understand. Rome didn't fall in one single moment. It wasn't like one day it was strong and the next day it was gone. It was more like a slow decline, like a giant tree rotting from the inside before finally collapsing. Some historians even argue that Rome never truly fell. It simply transformed. Because remember, the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. Its capital, Constantinople, became a center of trade, culture, and learning. In many ways, the Byzantines carried on the legacy of Rome until they themselves fell in 1453. So why do we call it the fall of Rome? Because the western half, which included the city of Rome itself, collapsed under the weight of its problems, and people in Europe felt the impact for centuries. The fall of Rome marked the beginning of what we often call the Middle Ages, a time when Europe was fragmented into smaller kingdoms and life was much harder for ordinary people. Without Rome's roads, aqueducts, and armies, life became more localized and less connected. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. While Rome's empire may have fallen, its influence never truly disappeared. In fact, if you look around today, you can still see Rome everywhere. Our languages, especially English, are full of Latin words. Our laws, governments, and even buildings are inspired by Roman ideas. The Roman alphabet is the one you're reading right now. And think about architecture. Grand government buildings, sports stadiums, even the design of Washington, D.C., all have Roman influence. And then there's Christianity. As I mentioned earlier, Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire in the early 300s AD. When Rome fell, Christianity didn't disappear. It spread even more, becoming one of the most powerful forces in European history. You could even argue that while the empire crumbled, its greatest legacy was helping shape the world's largest religion. Now, let me ask you something. Do you think history repeats itself? Many historians and thinkers have wondered if modern nations might one day face the same fate as Rome. Some even say the United States is like the modern Roman Empire, powerful, influential, but also facing challenges like political division, economic troubles, and external threats. Could the lessons of Rome's rise and fall apply to us today? It's a fascinating question. Think about it. Rome's strength came from discipline, unity, and innovation. But its weakness came from corruption, inequality, and overexpansion. Doesn't that sound like challenges many countries face today? That's why studying Rome is so important. It's not just about the past, it's about understanding the present and the future. Let us go back for a moment and imagine what it felt like for ordinary Romans as their empire declined. Imagine being a farmer on the edge of the empire, hearing rumors that barbarian tribes were approaching. Imagine being a soldier, once proud of serving the empire, now unsure if your pay would come or if your leaders would even survive another year. Imagine living in the city of Rome itself, once full of grandeur, now slowly crumbling with aqueducts breaking down and food becoming scarce. It must have been terrifying, like watching your whole world collapse piece by piece. And yet, people adapted. When Rome fell, people didn't just vanish. They carried on, formed new kingdoms, and built the foundation for the Europe we know today. In a strange way, the fall of Rome wasn't the end of history. It was the beginning of a new chapter. So, what can we learn from Rome? First, that no empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. Second, that success can create problems just as much as failure can. And third, that even when great civilizations fall, their ideas and influence can live on for thousands of years. Rome's roads may be broken, its emperors long gone, but its spirit is still alive in our world today. Before we wrap up, let me share one last thought. The story of Rome isn't just about battles, emperors, or politics. It's about people. Ordinary people who built the roads, fought in the legions, cheered in the Colosseum, and prayed in temples. Their lives, their struggles, and their dreams are what made Rome what it was. And in the end, that's what history is really about, Not just the rise and fall of empires, but the human stories behind them. So the next time you see a Roman statue, walk into a building with tall columns, or even glance at the calendar on your wall, remember, you're looking at the legacy of Rome. It may have fallen as an empire, but it will never disappear from our history. And if you enjoyed this journey through time, make sure to give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Rome's story fascinated you the most? And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next adventure into history. Because trust me, there are so many more stories waiting to be told, and I'd love for you to join me on the journey.